Hello, botanists. So today we're going to learn about the plant kingdom. We're going to learn about what a plant is. We're going to learn about what the major groups of plants are, plant phyla, I mean. We're going to learn about plant life cycles and look at some of the details about how the plant life cycles vary among major types of plants, namely mosses and ferns and flowers. Let's get started with a description of plants. As you know, plants are autotrophs. They do photosynthesis, making their own food. Autotroph means self-feeding. Then plants are not the only autotrophs. There are some bacteria that do photosynthesis, and there are also some not quite plants, algae, that are mostly aquatic organisms. Not all of them, though. Many of those algae and all of those bacteria are unicellular, but unfortunately, for making definitions simple, there are some multicellular autotrophs that aren't plants, multicellular algae like seaweeds and some other freshwater algae. What makes plants different than algae is they're more complex. They have some differentiated organ systems. They have leaves, they have shoots, they have roots. Roots, shoots, and leaves. That's the punchline to a joke. I just don't know what the joke is yet. But uh, they also, plants have embryos that resemble a miniature adult. I mention that because, well, animal embryos are kind of peculiar. They're like a hollow ball of cells, and they don't look anything like the starfish or the human or the whatevs they develop into. Um, Plant embryos, you can actually see the parts of a plant. You can see the roots, the shoots, and the leaves. Roots, shoots, and leaves. That's the punchline to a joke. I just don't know what the joke is yet. I guess that's the joke. But plants are a clade, a group of organisms with a common ancestor, and also including the common ancestor, that are adapted for life on land. Plants are definitely terrestrial, and there's a lot of evidence that they evolved from algae. So this is a picture of an algae, an alga is the singular. It's called Spirogyra. It's a freshwater algae. It's like some pond scum. You might want to call it that if you're uh, into dissing algae. And this is what Spirogyra looks like under the microscope. This is beautiful. It's filamentous and has beautiful spiral chloroplasts. It's kind of cool. This algae, this is a lot more complicated than most algae are. It looks like some sort of pondweed. And if it weren't for the fact that I kind of know that this is what Cara, the stone wort, looks like, I wouldn't have known it was an algae. I saw this growing in a ditch along Route 315 in Columbus. This is a fairly advanced algae, and it's believed to be the algae that is very closely resembles the ancestors of plants. So, thinking in terms of what life was like, what the prospects were for being on land from ancestors that were aquatic. Lots of promising, promising things about life on land. So some little smiley emojis go here. Smiley emojis. It was lots of sunlight that plants need for photosynthesis. Lots of carbon dioxide that plants need for photosynthesis. And at least in the beginning, not a lot of things that would try to kill you or eat you if you were an algae-like organism considering life on newly exposed land back in the Silurian period of the Paleozoic era, I guess. Um, but on the other hand, a little frowny face emoji. Now, the way this slide is put together is not the way usually the people using English language use parentheses, but the way it's drawn is that there's these problems, these stresses of terrestrial life, and then some ways to overcome them are in parentheses. So, for example, on land, not in water, you might dry out. And one of the ways to not dry out is to be like waterproof. And so there's this waxy covering that's called a cuticle that is basically like waterproofing, like wax paper or something that most plants have at the outer surface of their leaves. Another thing that some plants have is plumbing internally, because instead of getting all the resources by diffusion from the environment the way you would if you're algae floating around or in the water. You need to get gases and water vapor from the air and water and nutrients from the soil. And a lot of plants have plumbing, basically internal plumbing. It's vascular tissue. I gotta figure out how that stop happening. There's one called xylem that carries water. And there's one called phloem that carries food. And those are the two vascular tissues that some plants have. Another thing that many plants have is a way to be upright rather than being supported by buoyancy, to be able to stand tall and firm in air. The walls of many plants are imbued with a chemical called lignin that makes them very, very stiff. It makes wood woody. And so a lot of plants have this feature that allows them to be upright and rigid. And a feature that is actually present in all plants is the one here that is not super well explained by the term protective gametangia. And what I'd like to explain about that is that the egg is and the developing embryo, they're kind of delicate, sensitive, vulnerable stages in the life cycle. And in water, organisms don't have the stresses that they do on land. And so plants, what they do is they have their egg-producing structure retain the egg rather than release it. And the embryo, when it gets fertilized, the embryo develops inside that container called the gametangium. And so this retention of the embryo, rather than just releasing the eggs and sperm into the environment, sperm yes, eggs no, is a feature of all plants, and it's an advancement over algae. Pollen, by the way, is a feature that's only found in the more recently evolved plants, the seed plants, and that's just one more way to overcome the lack of water in the environment. And as we'll see, it's a way that pollen can travel without, sperm can travel without having to swim. So here's a chart, and I'll show you a prettier version of this chart, but that actually has professional typing in here rather than this writing that I'm doing. But I like writing. So I just want to point out what we're about to see coming up. So one of the things we're about to see is this, I guess it's this, this line here. It represents vascular tissue. So, and it might not be super apparent from the diagram unless you look really closely, but the key thing to keep in mind is that this fern over here on the right has vascular tissue, and this moss over here in the middle does not. And this is an advancement that some but not all plants have. Over here on the left, this represents algae, and what you're supposed to see about the algae is it's kind of supported by buoyancy. The gametes, especially the sperm, are indicated here, freely swimming in the water. I'm going to write gametes, and that is not a plant. It's a precursor of plants. Here on land, we have the moss. Another thing that the moss has, about which we'll learn a lot more later, are spores. Spores are single cells that can make new plants all by themselves. Notice that both the moss and the fern, they have these little swimmy sperms. They need to have environmental water in order for sexual reproduction to take place. In order for the sperm to meet the egg, the sperm has to swim through some sort of water. And that is true for all the plants except seed plants. Here is a seed plant. And the seed plant, of course, it's fairly advanced, so it also has vascular tissue that I'm sure shows up here in this drawing. It's in red, which is a weird color. You have to be like a trichromatic mutant in order to see it very well. And I'm not one of those trichromatic mutants like most people are. Trichromatic mutant is what someone who's colorblind calls someone who's not colorblind, in case you were wondering. So what the seed plants have, this is a conifer. I think the slide that's labeled says it's a pine tree, but I don't think it's a pine tree. Not with leaves like this. Pine trees have leaves in clusters. I'm not sure what kind of conifer this is supposed to be. But what the seed plant has is, surprise, it has seeds. And the other thing that the seed plants have is pollen. And pollen is basically a delivery system for sperm. So inside pollen, there is sperm, and it can blow through the air, be carried by birds or bats or bees or butterflies, any kind of animal whose name begins with a B. And that's what one of the final advancement that makes seed plants be especially free from the necessities of aquatic nests that characterize their algal antecedents. So here's a more show-offy version of that, and blue. And so, as we mentioned, we have vascular tissue in the fern, but not in the moss. We have sperm swimming in the algae and in the moss and in the fern, and we have spores in all of these plants. The moss does not have roots. It has rhizoids, which are kind of attachment structures that aren't vascular, so they don't have to be called roots. I think rhizoid just means like root-like. And similarly, as mentioned before, the seed plant, of course, is a vascular plant, and it has pollen, which carries sperm. It has a seed, which is basically a baby plant with some protective coating and also some food, and it's basically a miniature plant. And those are the major advancements that plants underwent in their march toward land from their water world. Great. So we'll take a break now. Coming next, what we're going to see is some of the major groups of plants. We're going to look at the plant phylogeny and see the phyla of plants. How do you make this stop? Come on. Escape. Escape. Yes. Keep. Discard.